On a bitter cold morning in February 1945, Second Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood shivering in the frozen courtyard of Camp Atterbury, Indiana, watching his breath form white clouds in the frigid air. The young officer from Osaka had been captured 6 months earlier in the Philippines, and everything he had been told about American barbarity seemed confirmed by the harsh conditions of the transport ship that brought him across the Pacific. Now surrounded by endless level farmland and guarded by men he expected to treat him with the same brutality he had witnessed in the jungle warfare, Yamamoto braced himself for the suffering he was certain would come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yamamoto and thousands of other Japanese prisoners would discover over the following months would shatter every assumption they held about their captors, transform their understanding of honor and humanity, and leave them facing a truth more unsettling than any battlefield defeat. Camp Atterbury sprawled across 40,000 acres of Indiana countryside, a vast complex of barracks and administrative buildings that had been hastily constructed in 1942. By early 1945, it housed nearly 3,000 Japanese prisoners of war, men who had fought across the Pacific theater from Guadalcanal to Leyte Gulf. Unlike their counterparts in Japanese custody, where starvation and disease claimed the lives of more than 1 in 4 Allied prisoners, these men found themselves in conditions that defied everything their military training had taught them to expect. Corporal William Harrison from Springfield, Illinois, had volunteered for guard duty at Atterbury, partly out of curiosity. The 23-year-old farmhand turned soldier had lost a cousin at Pearl Harbor and another at Tarawa. He expected to hate the prisoners. What he discovered instead was a group of men as bewildered by their circumstances as he was by the orders he received regarding their treatment. The first meal Yamamoto ate in American custody became a moment that would haunt him for decades. It was not the quantity of food that shocked him, though there was far more rice and protein than he had seen in months. It was who sat down to eat it with him. Harrison and 2 other guards carried their own trays into the mess hall and sat at the same long wooden tables as the prisoners, eating identical meals from identical plates. Yamamoto stared at the pork cutlet on his tray, then at the guard sitting 3 feet away, methodically cutting his own piece of meat. In the Japanese military, such a scene would have been unthinkable. Officers ate separately from enlisted men, who ate separately from prisoners who often did not eat at all. The rigid hierarchy that defined every aspect of military life made the idea of captors and captives sharing a meal as absurd as the idea of a general sharing his bath with a private. Then Harrison said something that made Yamamoto's translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Kenneth Tanaka, pause before rendering the words into Japanese. The guard had asked if the food was acceptable, if the portion was sufficient, if there was anything else the prisoners might need. Not an order, not a demand. A question, spoken in the same tone one might use when addressing a dinner guest. Over the following days, Yamamoto observed a pattern that contradicted everything he understood about military discipline and the treatment of defeated enemies. The guards who supervised work details in the camp's maintenance shops did not carry clubs or whips. When prisoners were assigned to help with agricultural work on nearby farms, they traveled in open trucks with a single armed guard, who often spent the journey teaching them English phrases. The punishment for minor infractions consisted of extra duties or loss of recreation privileges, not beatings or starvation rations. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American guard from San Francisco, became an unlikely bridge between captors and captives. His ability to speak Mandarin helped him communicate basics with some of the older prisoners who had served in China, and his willingness to explain American customs helped demystify the bewildering behavior of the camp staff. One afternoon in March, Chen sat with a group of prisoners during a break from agricultural work, sharing cigarettes and attempting to explain baseball. The prisoners listened with polite confusion as Chen described the rules of a game that seemed to have no clear military purpose. Then one of the prisoners, a former schoolteacher named Hiroshi Nakamura, asked a question that revealed the deep gulf between their experiences. Why, Nakamura wanted to know, did the Americans feed their prisoners the same food the guards ate? In his experience as a soldier, Japanese guards had consumed rice and fish, while prisoners received watery gruel when they received anything at all. The idea that captors would voluntarily reduce their own rations to ensure equality seemed to violate basic military logic. Chen thought for a long moment before answering. He explained the Geneva Conventions, the international agreements that governed the treatment of prisoners of war. But more than that, he explained the American belief, perhaps idealistic but genuinely held, that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings, that a man who surrendered was no longer a combatant but a prisoner entitled to specific protections and dignities. The concept troubled Nakamura deeply. In the Japanese military code, surrender itself was the ultimate dishonor, a betrayal of everything a soldier should embody. Prisoners were less than nothing, their shame so profound that death would have been preferable. Yet here he sat, eating bread and cheese with an American soldier who seemed genuinely interested in teaching him about baseball and who had asked his opinion about which fields should be planted with corn and which with soybeans. As spring arrived and the Indiana landscape transformed from frozen brown to vibrant green, the cognitive dissonance experienced by the Japanese prisoners deepened. They were put to work in various capacities around the camp and on surrounding farms, and they were paid. Not much, just 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen for candy, cigarettes, and toiletries. But the very existence of payment for labor shocked men accustomed to a system where prisoners worked until they collapsed or died. Sergeant First Class James Mitchell, a career soldier from Georgia who supervised the agricultural work details, found himself developing an unexpected respect for his charges. The Japanese prisoners approached every task with the same meticulous attention to detail they had presumably applied to military duties. Fields were planted in perfectly straight rows. Tools were cleaned and stored with obsessive care. When Mitchell demonstrated a technique for repairing fence posts, the prisoners practiced until they could replicate his movements exactly. But it was the small gestures that stayed with Mitchell long after the conflict ended. The way prisoners bowed slightly when receiving orders, a habit they could not break despite being told it was unnecessary. The care they took in maintaining the small gardens they were permitted to cultivate near their barracks, growing vegetables that reminded them of home. The songs they sang while working, melancholy tunes that needed no translation to convey their longing for families they might never see again. In May 1945, news reached the camp of the German surrender. The European conflict had ended, but the Pacific struggle continued with apparently unlimited ferocity. Reports of the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts, describing casualties that numbed the mind with their scale. American guards read about Marines fighting Japanese soldiers who preferred death to capture, who launched suicidal charges rather than surrender, who hid in caves and fought until ammunition and hope were both exhausted. And then these same guards sat down to lunch with Japanese prisoners who seemed like ordinary men, grappling with extraordinary circumstances. The contradiction created a kind of psychological whiplash. How could these polite, hard-working prisoners be the same breed of soldiers who had fought with such desperate ferocity on distant islands? Yamamoto understood the paradox from the other side. He had been raised to believe Americans were soft, corrupted by comfort and individualism, lacking the spiritual strength that came from dedication to emperor and nation. Yet the guards at Atterbury displayed a different kind of strength, a discipline rooted not in fear of punishment, but in adherence to principles that seemed to operate even when no one was watching. He thought about this one evening in June, sitting in the camp library where prisoners were allowed to spend their free time reading English language books and magazines. Harrison, the young guard from Illinois, was there supervising, and during a quiet moment Yamamoto asked him through translator Tanaka why the Americans treated their prisoners so well. Harrison considered the question carefully. He admitted that he had struggled with it himself. His cousin had died when Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. His best friend from high school had been killed at Guadalcanal. He had expected to hate every Japanese soldier he ever encountered. But orders were orders, and the orders said prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. More than that, though, Harrison said something that Yamamoto would remember for the rest of his life. "We are fighting for our way of life," said Harrison, And part of our way of life is believing that every person has dignity, even our enemies. If we abandon that principle when it is difficult, then we are not really living by our principles at all. We are just pretending until things get hard. The conflict will end someday, and when it does, I want to remember that I behaved like the person I believe I should be, not like the person fear and anger tried to make me. The words, translated haltingly by Tanaka, struck Yamamoto with unexpected force. He had always understood war as a contest of wills, of determination, of willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. But Harrison was describing a different kind of struggle, an internal battle to maintain one's humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. As summer progressed and the Indiana heat replaced the spring coolness, the prisoners settled into routines that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. They played baseball in the recreation yard, using equipment provided by the Red Cross. They attended English language classes, taught by volunteers from nearby towns. They wrote letters home, which were carefully censored, but nonetheless allowed them to maintain some connection with the lives they had left behind. Technical Sergeant David Goldstein, a Jewish soldier from New York who managed the camp's educational programs, found himself in the surreal position of teaching Japanese grammar to men who had been his mortal enemies months before. Goldstein had lost family in Europe, relatives who had not escaped before borders closed and circumstances turned deadly. He carried a personal hatred for totalitarian regimes that had made systematic cruelty into state policy. Yet, here he sat, patiently explaining English verb conjugations to prisoners who listened with earnest concentration. One of his students, a former university student named Kenji Sato, asked Goldstein during a break how he could teach them after everything that had happened. Goldstein's answer was characteristically blunt. He explained that he hated what the Japanese government had done. He hated the military leadership that had started the conflict and sustained it with such brutality. But he did not believe that every individual soldier bore personal responsibility for the decisions made by generals and politicians. More importantly, he believed that education was one of the few forces powerful enough to prevent future conflicts. If even a few of these prisoners returned to Japan understanding that Americans were people rather than caricatures, that might plant seeds of something better. The philosophical question of responsibility and complicity hung over the camp like morning fog. Many of the prisoners had participated in actions they now struggled to reconcile with the treatment they received. Yamamoto himself had been present during operations where civilian populations were treated with casual brutality, where surrender by enemy soldiers was met with execution rather than capture. He had not personally committed atrocities, but he had witnessed them and said nothing, because that was what soldiers did. They followed orders and maintained unit cohesion and did not question decisions made by superiors. Now he found himself the recipient of mercy from an enemy that had every reason to reciprocate the cruelty he had witnessed. The psychological weight of this realization became almost unbearable. It would have been easier, in some ways, if the Americans had been the monsters propaganda had portrayed. Then his capture and imprisonment would fit neatly into a narrative of suffering and eventual redemption. Instead, he faced the far more difficult task of reconstructing his entire worldview. In early August, the camp's routine was shattered by news that arrived via radio broadcast. A new kind of weapon had been used against Hiroshima, a single device that had destroyed an entire city. The details were fragmentary and almost impossible to believe. Tens of thousands dead instantly, a mushroom-shaped cloud rising miles into the sky, destruction on a scale that rendered conventional conflict obsolete. 3 days later, another city, Nagasaki this time. And then on August 15th, the announcement that made the world stop spinning. Emperor Hirohito himself, speaking in a radio broadcast, informed his subjects that Japan would accept the terms of surrender demanded by the Allied powers. The reaction among the prisoners at Camp Atterbury defied simple description. Some wept openly, overwhelmed by relief that the conflict had ended and they might someday return home. Others sat in stunned silence, grappling with the reality that the unthinkable had occurred. The emperor, the divine figure who embodied the nation's spiritual essence, had acknowledged defeat. Everything they had been taught about endless resistance and death before dishonor suddenly seemed like hollow propaganda. Yamamoto's reaction was more complex, relief at survival mixed with shame at that relief. Grief for his destroyed homeland competed with gratitude that the killing had stopped, and beneath everything else, a growing recognition that he had been lied to about fundamental things, about the nature of the enemy, about the righteousness of the cause, about what it meant to be a soldier and a man. In the days following the surrender announcement, the atmosphere in the camp shifted in subtle but profound ways. Guards who had maintained professional distance began engaging prisoners in genuine conversation. Restrictions eased as the security concerns that had justified them became obsolete. Plans were initiated for eventual repatriation, though the logistics of returning thousands of prisoners across the Pacific would take many months to arrange. Harrison approached Yamamoto one evening as autumn began to paint the Indiana landscape in shades of red and gold. The young guard, who had been so uncertain about his assignment 9 months earlier, had developed a genuine curiosity about the men he supervised. He wanted to know what Yamamoto would do when he returned to Japan, how he would rebuild his life in a country that would be dramatically different from the one he had left. Yamamoto admitted that he did not know. His family's home had been in Osaka, which had suffered heavy damage from aerial bombardment. He had no idea if his parents or siblings had survived. Even if they had, he would return as a defeated soldier, carrying the shame of surrender that Japanese society viewed as worse than death. The skills he had acquired in military service, primarily those related to killing other human beings, seemed unlikely to be useful in whatever emerged from the ruins. But there was something else, something harder to articulate. Yamamoto tried to explain how his time at Atterbury had changed his understanding of fundamental concepts. Honor, which he had always associated with willingness to die, now seemed more connected to how one lived. Duty, which had meant unquestioning obedience to superiors, now appeared to include some obligation to question orders that violated basic decency. Strength, which military training had equated with the ability to endure and inflict suffering, might actually require the courage to choose mercy when cruelty would be easier. Harrison listened without interruption, recognizing that he was witnessing something rare and precious, a human being engaging in the agonizing process of reconstructing their worldview from first principles. The young guard from Illinois, who had begun this assignment expecting to hate his charges, found himself instead filled with a kind of awed respect. These men had traveled further than the miles between Japan and Indiana. They had journeyed from certainty to doubt, from rigid ideology to uncertain humanism, from seeing the world in black and white to recognizing that most of reality existed in shades of gray. The winter of 1945 to 1946 passed slowly. Prisoners remained at Atterbury even as the focus of the nation shifted to the challenges of peacetime. News from Japan painted a picture of devastation almost beyond comprehension. Cities reduced to rubble, industries destroyed, infrastructure shattered. And somehow, despite everything, people survived and began the long process of rebuilding. During this period, an unexpected program began at the camp. American soldiers preparing for occupation duty in Japan began meeting with prisoners to learn about Japanese culture, language, and customs. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Yesterday's enemies became today's teachers, providing insight into a culture that America would now play a major role in reshaping. Sergeant Mitchell, the agricultural supervisor from Georgia, participated in these sessions with genuine fascination. He learned about Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, about tea ceremonies and flower arranging, about a culture that had produced both exquisite art and brutal militarism. The apparent contradiction puzzled him until Nakamura, the former schoolteacher, offered an explanation. Every culture, Nakamura said through Tanaka's translation, contains the seeds of both beauty and horror. Japan had cultivated an aesthetic sensibility that found profound meaning in cherry blossoms and autumn leaves, in perfectly arranged stones and carefully pruned trees. But it had also developed a military culture that equated death with honor, that treated human life as expendable in service of abstract ideals, that created a system where cruelty became not only acceptable but mandatory. The same attention to detail that produced perfect gardens also produced efficient brutality. The same group loyalty that created strong communities also created unquestioning obedience to destructive orders. Mitchell found the analysis both troubling and illuminating. He began to see parallels in his own culture, the ways that American ideals of individual liberty could produce both innovation and inequality, how belief in manifest destiny had inspired both expansion and displacement. No nation, he realized, was simple. Every society contained multitudes, contradictions, possibilities for both greatness and terrible failure. As spring arrived again, and the Indiana landscape repeated its cycle of renewal, preparations intensified for the prisoners' repatriation. Ships were being assembled, schedules coordinated, bureaucratic processes completed. Most prisoners would return to Japan by early summer, traveling back across the Pacific to a homeland they barely recognized from the descriptions in letters and news reports. The farewell between Yamamoto and Harrison took place in the camp's main courtyard on a warm May morning in 1946. Both men struggled with emotions that military training had never prepared them to process. They had been enemies, then warden and prisoner, and finally something approximating friends, though that word seemed inadequate to describe the relationship they had developed. Harrison gave Yamamoto his address in Springfield, Illinois, and made him promise to write when circumstances allowed. Yamamoto, in turn, gave Harrison a small paper crane he had folded from a page of newspaper, explaining that in Japanese culture, the crane symbolized hope and recovery. Both men recognized the gesture as inadequate to the moment, but did their best anyway. As the trucks carrying prisoners rolled out through the camp gates toward the trains that would take them to the West Coast and the ships waiting there, Harrison watched and wondered what would become of these men. Would they be able to apply the lessons learned in Indiana to the shattered society they were returning to? Would the glimpse of a different way of organizing human relationships make any difference in a country that would be rebuilt under American occupation? He would never know the complete answer, but years later letters began to arrive. Yamamoto wrote first, in careful English, describing his return to Osaka and his work helping to rebuild his family's business. He mentioned almost casually that his experiences in America had changed how he approached management and how he treated employees. The hierarchical brutality that had characterized Japanese business culture before the conflict seemed to him now like a waste of human potential. He was trying, in his small way, to create something different. Other prisoners sent similar letters. Sato, the former university student, had become a teacher himself, working to introduce more critical thinking into Japanese education. Nakamura opened a cultural exchange program, helping Japanese students understand American society and American students understand Japan. Chen, the Chinese-American guard, received letters from prisoners he had supervised, thanking him for helping them see beyond propaganda to the humanity of their former enemies. The broader impact was harder to measure, but no less real. The American occupation of Japan, for all its flaws and complications, approached the defeated nation with less vindictiveness than many expected. The decision to treat Japanese prisoners of war with basic human dignity during the conflict created a foundation of goodwill, however fragile, that made reconstruction somewhat easier. Prisoners who returned home with stories of American fairness provided a counter-narrative to the most extreme anti-American propaganda. More fundamentally, the experience of Camp Atterbury and similar facilities demonstrated something important about human nature and the choices nations make. It would have been easy, perhaps even emotionally satisfying in the short term, to treat Japanese prisoners with the same brutality that characterized Japanese prisoner of war camps. Revenge is a powerful motivator, and the American soldiers guarding these camps had every reason to hate the men in their custody. But American leadership made a different choice. They decided that adherence to international law and basic human rights should not be conditional on whether enemies reciprocated. They decided that how America treated its prisoners said something essential about what America was and wanted to be. And they decided that soldiers like Harrison and Mitchell and Goldstein and Chen, men who had suffered losses and had reason for hatred, should be trusted to implement these principles even when doing so required extraordinary moral discipline. The success was imperfect. No institution involving human beings ever achieves perfection. There were failures of implementation, moments of cruelty, guards who could not set aside their hatred, prisoners who remained convinced that American kindness was an elaborate trick. But the overall pattern held. The United States treated hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, including tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners, in ways that adhered to international standards, even when enemies flagrantly violated those same standards. The men who experienced this treatment, who ate the same meals as their guards and were paid for their labor, and were educated rather than brutalized, carried those experiences back to their homeland. They became walking counterexamples to the propaganda that had portrayed Americans as demons. Their stories, shared quietly in families and communities, helped create space for reconciliation that might otherwise have been impossible. Yamamoto, in his final letter to Harrison before the Americans' death in 1978, tried to express something that had taken decades to fully understand. He wrote that the months at Camp Atterbury had been the most important educational experience of his life, more transformative than university, more impactful than military training, more meaningful than any book he had read. What he had learned was not a specific skill or body of knowledge, but something more fundamental. He had learned that the measure of a civilization was not its wealth or military power, but how it treated those who were powerless. That real strength meant having the capacity for cruelty, but choosing restraint. That honor was not about dying well, but about living well, about maintaining one's principles even when doing so was difficult or inconvenient. That enemies could become friends, not through grand gestures, but through thousands of small acts of decency compounded over time. These were lessons, Yamamoto wrote, that he had spent the rest of his life trying to apply and to share. They had shaped how he conducted business, raised his children, participated in his community. They had convinced him that the most important battles were not fought on actual battlefields, but in the daily choices individuals made about how to treat other human beings. The conflict had taken millions of lives and destroyed cities and reshaped the world's political order. But for him personally, the most significant outcome was discovering, in an Indiana prisoner of war camp, that the enemy he had been taught to hate was capable of extraordinary decency, and that this discovery required him to become a different person than the one who had been captured in the Philippines. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.